All right, we are back now with Senator Bruce Tarr, the Senate Minority Leader in the state of Massachusetts. And Senator, welcome back to MSO. We're in week number 2 of the new year. How you doing?
Well, thanks, Rick. I'm doing very well, and I hope you're doing well as also.
Absolutely, it's been a joy going to places now and seeing the limited use of masks. There are some establishments that still ask people to wear them as they go in, and I can appreciate that. It's not even a bother. I keep my mask with me all the time, but it's something, Senator, that in my lifetime I've never experienced, never hope to experience again. Absolutely historic, but I still haven't been able to put it in perspective. And with that said, maybe your view from the State House as to how the first couple of weeks of the so-called reopening has gone, because there are outdoor dining areas and so on, but for the most part, people have totally loved the lifting of the restrictions.
I agree, Rick, and I think it's going very well. We saw tremendous revenue increases that came in May for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, much more than we had expected. We see a lot of economic activity happening out there. And I do understand the issue with the masks. I mean, they have been part of what has protected public health and has gotten us to the point where we actually can have a reopened society and we can have businesses reopen and we can gather together. So they've been an important part of that, just as vaccines have. But I, like everyone else, or at least I think everyone else, am very pleased not to have to wear them anymore. And I find myself in a time of transition, as I'm sure you do as well, Rick, where we have to think about, where am I going to need a mask? Because it's not as easy as everywhere I need to wear a mask now. So I keep one tucked in my pocket, and I find if I need to have it on, I have it available. But you know what? That's a small price to pay for regaining all the freedom that we right now have.
I agree. And what I do is I have it with me, and I cautiously walked up to whatever retail establishment I might be going to or whatever, and make sure I look for all the signs outside and read the signs. And then occasionally there will be nothing on the outside doors, but I walk in and the employees will have masks on, and I go into a panic, and they say, no, no, we're under a certain age, or we're haven't been vaccinated, or so on. So everybody who's still required or needs to wear a mask, and those who don't, it seems to be a sort of a symbiotic relationship, and it's respectful. And I think you know that that bodes well, I think, for the leadership in the state and how things have gone, and you know how the whole thing has been handled in general. We've talked about that many times before. So anyway, it's a good feeling. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I agree, Rick. And again, as we're all trying to put the pandemic into perspective and think about what we've just been through, and it's been very traumatic. And so there's a human tendency, I think, to try to not think about some of it. But as we try to get past that, we have to remember the tremendous amount of loss of human life and the hardship and the suffering and the economic disruption that we've had. But through all that, I think it's important as well to remember how people have pulled together, how there have been countless examples of people who rose to the challenge of the pandemic to help their neighbors, as a doctor or a nurse, as a first responder, as a truck driver, as someone who just continued to show up to do their job when we needed them during extremely difficult times. And my hope is that those are things we will not soon forget. And we'll remember that inspiration of those folks, and we'll remember to thank them. And we won't just charge forward and say, well, things are better now and we need to never look back. I think we do need to think about what we've been through and the people who've helped us get through it. And in Massachusetts, certainly it's been a rocky road. There's no doubt about that. But we also saw a lot of positives in the way people pulled together and did wear masks and have gotten vaccinated and continue to, and are moving us forward to protect public health. Because above all else, I think what the pandemic has reminded us of is just how much we depend on each other. We might like to think we're independent, we don't need anyone else, but the pandemic has reminded us that we do.
And I'm going to take that one step further. Politically, I think you could say that globally. I'll end it right there. You have been very busy the last couple of weeks, as have all the other legislators, with the budget, the state budget, and that is sort of now taken care of. But you also have looked over things in terms of continuing emergency measures that may still be needed with respect to the pandemic? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, Rick, and that's a great segue from the discussion we just had, in that there are some things we did during the pandemic to be able to help continue things like restaurant businesses or meetings of local government or access to medical care. And many of those things deserve to be extended, at least temporarily, and maybe some of them even more than temporarily. But in order to have a smooth transition, we need to address these things because most of them are tied to the public health emergency that the governor declared at the outset of the pandemic. And that public health emergency is set to expire on June 15th, which is next Wednesday. And so if we're going to continue the vast majority of these things, we need to take further action. And that's what we've been working on in the Senate this week, looking at things that we have done temporarily because we needed to do them, and trying to determine which ones should be extended, and also trying to think about which ones we may want to retain indefinitely. But right now, what's important is we get a bill done by next Wednesday, or as close to that as we can possibly come. So we unanimously approved a bill to extend many of the COVID-19 provisions that we had enacted. And the bill, Rick, has so many different subjects, and I'm just looking at a list of them here, that it would be hard to describe all of them, but I thought I might talk about a few that are illustrative of the kinds of things we're talking about. So one of them, and we've talked about this a fair amount, is the issue of outdoor dining and allowing restaurants to be able to maybe move onto a sidewalk or move into the street for a little bit to be able to expand their dining capacity. Well, we know that restaurants are still struggling. They've had a very difficult time of it with the pandemic. And outdoor dining is a way that we can help them recover, particularly now that things are opening up and we're getting into the summer season where outdoor dining is more attractive. And so one of the things that this bill does is to be able to continue outdoor dining. The municipalities still have to decide, but we would continue outdoor dining up until April 1st of 2022 to allow restaurants to be able to get through the winter and get into next spring. And this is a subject, Rick, that I think is going to get more attention because there is a fair amount of consensus that this may be something we want to continue indefinitely, but it's going to need some more work. So for instance, we need to think about disruption of traffic patterns and the consumption of parking spaces. But for now, we're extending it so that we can think about it even more. And similarly, one of the other things that we did for restaurants and for consumers was to allow cocktails and alcohol to be provided on a to-go basis or on a delivered basis. And that too is being extended in this bill. And so that is going to be extended until March 1st of 2022 if the Senate version of the bill prevails. So again, allowing restaurants to capture the busy season going into next spring. Now, there are other things that are important too. And one of the things was important during the pandemic is being able to make sure that local boards like select boards and city councils could meet. And so we allowed for them to meet remotely, and we had to create an exception to the public meeting law and the open meeting law to do that. And we're going to extend that exception so that they can continue to be able to do that. Now, here again, we're going to extend that to April 1st of 2022. But this is also an idea where I think you may see some more discussion about making this more permanent, not as it's currently constituted, but in some way, because we've heard from a lot of folks that they've been able to attend meetings remotely that they might not otherwise ever have been able to get to if they were required to be there in person. So we're extending this in the Senate version of the bill. I think the House will follow in that same vein, but we do want to think about it some more. And just a couple of other things, Rick. One of the things that's been important in terms of continuity of medical care is telemedicine. In a lot of cases, folks could not get to a doctor physically. They could not get to a healthcare provider, but they could get the care they needed through telemedicine remotely. And so in our bill, what we do is extend the payment rates so that telemedicine would be compensated at the same rate as it would be for an in-person visit. to be able to allow that to happen and allow providers to continue to do it. And this again is a subject where I think there's more discussion that's going to be had. I know I certainly want to have that discussion about making this more permanent, but for right now, we're continuing it to make sure we have an element of continuity. Same thing is true with regard to housing. And so we wanted to prevent evictions during the pandemic because it doesn't make sense for someone to lose their housing and then have to go into a congregate setting or some other thing that is much less desirable than having your own housing situation. And so there have been some anti-eviction provisions that have been in place. Those are going to be extended as well. But at the same time, we're looking at ways to try to help landlords who may not have had the benefit of getting a rental payment who need that also. And one of the conditions of the prevention of an eviction is that the tenant would have had to have applied for assistance with paying their rent so that hopefully they could get that assistance and pay the landlord. So we're trying to work through those issues, but eviction protections are also contained in this extension bill. Now, the bill was adopted unanimously. It was a tremendous bipartisan effort, very encouraging on that front, and it now moves to the House. And our expectation is the House is going to take it up very quickly next week, because again, we want to get this done as close to June 15th as we possibly can. And the House may have differences in its bill, which means we'd have to reconcile them. We're hoping to keep that to a minimum and to get this bill moving and get it on the governor's desk to provide continuity and stability and a good transition, particularly again, as we're trying to capture the economic opportunities from the situation that you described. That we now have our mobility back. We have the ability to go to restaurants, to gather together, to go into businesses, to go into retailers. We want to make sure that we capture as much of that as we can, because those businesses have suffered tremendously during the pandemic.
Excuse me, before we go to our final topic that involves the House supplemental budget, I believe, I just want to ask you, Senator, all that you just mentioned, it seems to me, and I know you personally, and the residents of Gloucester know you by your first name because you're here. And it seems to me that what all the things you've just described, that the Senate in particular, I don't know about the House, but although I would guess it also extends to them, is comprised of members who listen to their people and they go home for the most part at night, and then they bring this back to the Statehouse. And it seems to be very personal, Senator.
It is very personal. Our first obligation, Rick, is to protect the public health and safety of the folks that we represent, but we also have other obligations like ensuring that they have prosperity and that people have a way to be able to go to work and to purchase the things that they need and to be able to have the kind of stability in their lives that they should have. And these are very important subjects along that front. And again, that's what drives the legislative process. That's what should drive the legislative process. We do hear concerns. We try to respond to them. And this bill is a good example of that, Rick, as you point out, where we took a bundle of things that we needed to do to help people. And many of those things were enacted at different times during the pandemic, but we put them all together so that as we emerge from the pandemic, we can have a smooth transition.
That's encouraging. Well, what about the House now? What's our final thought?
So the House is working on a supplemental budget, which they passed this week. It spends about $260 million. And again, supplemental budgets, we've talked a little bit about in the past. They're done because budgeting is not perfect. And sometimes you might budget for an account and that account doesn't need as much money, so it has a surplus, but another account might have a deficiency. And so supplemental budgets are done to reconcile those differences and to make sure we move money where it needs to go. But they're also often including amendments and provisions that are in outside sections, which may be unrelated directly to spending, but are very important. And the one that I would highlight that's in the House bill is the issue of making changes, but continuing the Fiscal Management and Control Board for the MBTA. And I had a hand in creating that Fiscal Management and Control Board when it was desperately needed. And I believe we continue to need to have strong management of the MBTA. But if we don't act soon, the Fiscal Management and Control Board that I originally worked to produce and wrote one of the original amendments for, that will expire. So the House is trying to continue it in their version of the supplemental budget. I hope we're going to do the same because we need to have that continuity. So there's a lot happening, Rick, on Beacon Hill, and we continue to stay focused on it. And again, every day, try to go into our respective chambers and do the things we need to do to make life better in Massachusetts.